Hi there, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. I'm not super familiar with using this particular type of microphone, so if you can't hear me at any point, just give me a little wave and I'll sort it out. As I say, this is the topic of my talk here. I want to talk about seizing the initiative back to the red side, and we'll talk about why I feel that this is a topic we should be talking about in a second. So this is me. That's my Twitter handle up there. I'm a red teamer over at Nettitude. I tend to run large, complicated infrastructure pen tests as well. So we're talking multi-continent, multi-domain, multi-forest sort of organizations, as well as doing the red team side of things. I also used to be a systems administrator, so I used to run networks before I started breaking them, or breaking into them, I guess. And I find that really does help quite significantly, because I understand how admins think and understand why admins make the errors that they do make. I've spoken at a couple of other places, so with JISEC Dubai, about trusted third-party breaches. SteelCon, I did a talk there with a colleague, Ross Bingham, called Splunk versus Kerberos, because I understand Kerberos is pretty much the attack surface for most organizations these days. And as well, I've just spoken very recently at B-Sides Manchester, talking about how to detect red team lateral movement. Those slides are all up on YouTube, and they're on our GitHub as well, so if you want to get the copy-paste and stuff like that. I also have delivered our red team training course that Nettitude deliver if you want to stand up your own red team offering yourselves, and also just improve your operator skills if you are doing red teaming already. As it is CRESTCon, I've got a variety of CREST certifications as well. So I've got Simulated Attack Specialist and Infrastructure Tester. So this is what we'll be covering. I'm going to explain what I think, and hopefully it aligns quite closely with what Nettitude think, of what red teaming actually is. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Then we'll break into the good stuff, the red versus blue, and I'll explain why I think that's a problem or a success, depending on which side of the coin you're looking at as well. So we'll talk about PowerShell version 5 and everything that gives the blue team and the move to offensive C# tooling. We'll also talk about process tree mapping and how we've reacted as a red team to that. We'll then also move on to the rise of EDR, which is allegedly the silver bullet that sales guys are loving, okay? And then we'll talk about how actually it's not really a problem at all. We'll also talk about, this is a really important thing for me, how blue teams can get back on the front foot and seize the initiative back, okay? Because actually, you have the ability to get some really quick wins in your organizations if you're on the blue side, or if you're on the red side, this is a really good way of getting caught and getting kicked out. And then we'll talk about how actually most of the deception products that are out there, if we scratch the surface on them, they're not that good either. And then most importantly, if you're pressed for time, money, resources, and things like that, if you're going to do anything, prioritize on these things first. So, red teaming context. Okay, so red teaming is non-cooperative threat intelligence delivered testing. Okay, if you're doing red teaming without a threat intelligence phase at the start, you're genuinely really depriving yourself of huge amounts of value, both from a sort of service deliverer side and also as a buying community. The threat intelligence part of red teaming is absolutely critical. If you get decent threat intelligence, you're going to have a decent red team, as in you're going to get better. And after that, after the red team, whether we get to the objective or not, we need to have a pretty robust detection and response assessment. Because the whole point of a red team isn't to get to the objective. The whole point of a red team is to make the blue team better. That's why our whole industry exists. It's to improve our customers' defensive and responsive capabilities. Okay? And we often see that actually sometimes customers don't have a particularly strong detection, but when we provide them with something that they can run with, actually their response, their threat hunting playbook is actually quite well refined too. So there's two parts to it. If we're not using threat intelligence and we're not doing detection and response, I actually think you're not actually doing red teaming properly. You're doing an objective-based pen test, pretty much down a command and control channel, down C2, and you're depriving of really quite significant values. If we say where should red teaming sit in a sort of maturity model, if we say down the bottom of a maturity model, we've got inventory management, config management, and then we move up, we've got vulnerability management, we move up a little bit further, we've got sort of commodity pen testing, then objective-led pen testing, and then at the pinnacle of services, premium services, we have red team, and it comes towards the end of a maturity cycle. However, it can actually be very effective in running a red team to provide the stimulus to an organization that they need to invest in certain areas. So sometimes customers will do a red team quite early on in their maturity model, simply to provide evidence, basically, of where they need to prioritize. Most importantly as well, we're going to talk quite heavily about operating as part of the red team for the rest of this talk, but actually, quite significantly, everything else that goes around that service delivery is equally as important. You know, red teaming it's in production. There's no pre-prod, there's no dev, there's no UAT, user acceptance testing for red teaming, certainly not in my experience. Okay, so if we get it wrong, you know, we can have catastrophic effects. You know, if we're actually in people's SWIFT accounts, people's mortgages, people's pensions, you know, people's insurance. If we get it wrong, we're going to be on the front page of BBC News. So actually risk reduction workshops, talking about what's acceptable, authorizations to move from tertiary to a secondary to a primary assets is all quite significant. Daily updates and things like that. And indeed, the post-engagement debriefs at management and technical are actually really critical as well. So let's talk about the good stuff then. How is the blue team powered up? Okay, so PowerShell version 5 came across and the security community instantly threw their arms in the air and loudly proclaimed that PowerShell as an offensive language was totally dead. My personal opinion is it's probably not dead yet because we're not talking about running PowerShell.exe in 2019. We're talking about making use of system.management.automation.dll, which is interactive direct to the .NET framework. And actually it isn't dead, because many people still have PowerShell version 2 installed on all their endpoints, even with the latest, greatest versions of Windows 10. And more importantly, PowerShell version 5 does give you quite significant increases in defensive capability. You've got script block logging, which hopefully people have heard of, but actually we find that lots of people have configured script block logging, which is a good thing, but actually what are they doing with those logs? You know, are they just basically being piped to Splunk and no one is ever looking at them? We're not parsing them, we've got no detections built off the back of all that information. You know, so we're collecting information, doing no analysis, and then wondering why we've got no intelligence. And also, in PowerShell version 5, we've got obviously the exposure of the AMSI, anti-malware scanning interface, which is a significant improvement in terms of antivirus visibility into those PowerShell processes. And when we combine PowerShell version 5 and AMSI, it's actually quite potent for the defender. You know, most sort of low-level, non-customized command and control frameworks will get caught these days, usually relating to process injection, but we'll talk about how to get around that in a second. So luckily, when PowerShell script block logging arrived, we did some research as a security community, and there's a gentleman called Cobber who works at SpectreOps in the US. We discovered that when you start a PowerShell process or a system.management automation process, it reads from the registry the settings for PowerShell logging. Makes sense? But actually, that reading there remains consistent for the entirety of that process. So at each command, it doesn't check the value of that variable, just checks it once at the start. But as it's a variable, and as it's in user land, obviously as the attacker, we control that. So actually, you can just run this command here, which will in effect remove the script block logging for the rest of that command process. Worth noting, however, that if they are doing script block logging, this command to disable script block logging will be the last thing that's logged. So you can actually build some pretty robust detections over this. So if you detect an attacker disabling script block logging, you can detect him off the back of that. You might notice that this gets caught slightly with some static string detections, but if you move those quotations around, you'll have no issues getting past most things. Luckily, again, some really clever people came with C# as an offensive language. And we've got C# implants in POSH C2. Cobalt Strike has had that for a while with the execute assembly function. And now we've got Covenant over from Cobber at SpectreOps again, which is like a .NET related implant. And actually, AMSI integration, anti-malware scanning interface integration into C# tooling is not that strong currently. .NET 4.8 came out in April this year. Haven't actually seen it on a target yet. And here we are in sort of September, October time. Simply because large corporates don't move that quick, really, do they? They've got large change management windows, they've got dev, pre-prod, UAT, and all that good stuff. But also, when they do roll out AMSI integrations, we can actually unhook it in exactly the same fashion as we've been doing in PowerShell, which is quite good. So the PowerShell AMSI bypass, which is the AMSI scan buffer one, is actually quite well known. And so we were quite concerned when Microsoft announced AMSI integrations for .NET 4.8. A little bit of research later, and it was revealed that actually exactly the same technique from the PowerShell land works quite effectively in C# land. And it looks a little bit like this. Okay, so this is the PS one, if you're not familiar with it. Here you're just declaring a load of .NET code into a variable $win32. Then you add that type there, and you can see here it gets the location of the AMSI.dll and then looks for this particular string within it, this particular area of memory. And then we quite simply remove the protections on it and write those bytes over the top of where AMSI scan buffer was. And that's it, done. Now, then from that, you can then patch the memory permissions back, and then from that, you can run your second stage payload, whatever that happens to be. I wouldn't recommend using this particular as your next stage in terms of process tree tracking. It's quite poor, but it's just as a proof of concept. Here, you could use like shell windows in a decom method or something like that, combined with auto-migrating shellcode, and you'll be all good. Luckily, if you want to know how POSH-C2, which as of 6 days ago now has this baked into it, if you want to find out, you can decompile the core.exe, which is the implant itself in POSH-C2, and I'll explain the mechanics of how that works. First off, it adjusts the memory permissions, because actually by default you can't write or amend that part of memory. It'll patch the memory addresses in the same fashion, and then more importantly, this is something I haven't seen other tooling do, it changes the old permissions back to what it used to be to help avoid detections from Kaspersky. And we'll talk about the read, write, execute page permissions now. So this is from this is from the sort of the Nettitude private repo of core DLLs from POSH. There's nothing super sensitive here because you can just decompile core.exe yourselves in something like ILSpy or something, and that will work. And you can see that actually, in terms of a technique, the C# AMSI bypass is exceptionally similar to the PowerShell one. So actually, all of the Microsoft research, it's not that powerful. We can exactly here, we adjust the memory protections, and then we making a change, overwrite those bytes, and then literally change the permissions straight back. Okay, and you'll be able to grab all this off our GitHub after this. Okay, so actually, AMSI arrived and red team reacted. Okay, then EDR arrived with process tree tracing, really significant increase in defensive capability. Even like lower skill analysts can now start doing some quite advanced stuff just with their default dashboards. So this here is an extract on the left from the bit 9 high threat feeds for Carbon Black. And actually you can see that quite a significant amount of these things of most attacker tooling will cover by default. So suspicious process execution, not very detailed, but if you drill down into that, you can start seeing that certain directories with files being executed from looks very odd, whether it's ctemp or app data. You can also see the suspicious parent process of SVC host. Okay, that should only be instantiated from like the normal processing side of life. You know, we shouldn't see WinWord or something similar calling SVC host as a parent-child relationship. That's not a good sign usually if you see that on your endpoints. More importantly, we can see that processors writing hidden and system files, which is the default in POSH-C2, for example, is actually exceptionally dangerous in terms of Carbon Black detections. So actually what you can do in POSH-C2, just pass it the -not hidden, -not system flags, and actually the chance of getting caught by Carbon Black decreases quite significantly. And indeed, system profiling via WIMI. If you want to know a little bit more about WIMI, Matt Graber's got an awesome white paper from Black Hat 2015. And we should probably do a bit of credit to Will Burgess from MWR and Casey Smith. Will Burgess did a really, really awesome talk at Wild West Hacking Fest called Red Teaming in the EDR Age. They've got a good tool called Gargoyle about memory detections and stuff like that. Quite firmly recommend that. Okay, so this is a good, strong improvement for the blue side, except it's actually relatively simple to get around yet again. So you can see how the inevitable cat and mouse. Luckily, so far, red is a quick mouse, I guess. So what we're doing here, I won't get too much into the mechanics of what's going on here, but we are able to spoof our parent process, okay? Yeah, and that we can also then spoof our command line arguments again. If you've seen from FuzzySec, which is Ruben, he's got a tool called ETW. I think it's Event Trace Window or something like that. That will show you actually how you can build in PPID spoofing and argument spoofing into your own C2 framework if you're running your own C2. So here we are basically, instead of having a parent process of whatever Windows thinks it is, we interact directly with the Windows API and tell it that our parent process is something different. What that looks like from the Defender side is this. So we can see here we've got SVC host, Windows Explorer calling SVC host. Looks fairly legitimate, okay? And now SVC host is now carrying on, and that's our current process for our implant. And that's really just really simple to achieve from an attacker side of life. It's built into POSH-C2. Migrate, pass it the binary you want to inject into, pass it a suspended thread, and then we'll use RTL create user thread, to execute it when we resume the process, and just pass it the parent ID of the thing you want to spoof. So in terms of complexity required from attacker side, quite minimal, but in terms of impact to the detection from the blue side, generally quite significant. Just if you're not familiar with PPID spoofing and things like that, parent process, Cobalt, you may have seen Raphael Mudge's series called, in his Adversary Tactics YouTube series, called Session Prepping. What that's just talking about using the spawn2 variable in your malleable C2 profile if you're running Cobalt Strike. But more importantly, you need to know what situational awareness is. What is normal for that environment? A really strong detection method is presence of the abnormal and absence of the normal. So if you as an admin or a blue teamer don't actually know what normal looks like in your environment, how are you going to find an attacker? Because he will be creating abnormal events and you won't be able to find it. A really good example is situational awareness. They'll probably whitelist certain binaries in Carbon Black. So if they're using stuff like Landsweeper or PRTG or some other sort of network monitoring tool, those binaries will probably be whitelisted somewhere. Maybe it's in Sysmon, maybe it's in Tanium, maybe it's in Carbon Black, which is actually really awesome because they'll quite often, network monitoring servers will be layer 3 routable to absolutely everywhere in the environment. And also just talking about process injection, by the time you're doing PPID spoofing and things like that, relatively high skill from an attacker side, depending on what the threat intelligence says, probably don't need to be using create remote thread as a process injection method. It's quite noisy, lots of research has gone into it, you'll probably get caught. There's plenty of other methods, again, baked into POSH, baked into Cobalt Strike that you can use. If you're not too familiar with process injection, and you want a bit of a 10-minute read on the different types, have a quick read of this Endgame blog down here. It's actually really, really good. It's got pictures, which is an improvement on most articles, so it's really good stuff. Okay, so we can see that blue have had some good power-ups over the last year, maybe 2 years. Okay, and we can see that red has reacted, and we continue to stretch the blue side. But more importantly, now even relatively small companies, when they renew their antivirus, they're not. They're just going straight to EDR. And out of the box, most EDR isn't that bad, actually. Everything needs tuning for your environment, and you need to get someone who knows what they're doing to do that. But actually, out of the box, that will give you an increase in detection capabilities. So I'll just give you a quick run through on how EDR hooking works without getting too down into the weeds. So most of them have some aspect of kernel mode, and it looks a little bit like this. So let's say we're currently operating over here in the user process bit, but we want to do process injection here with virtual alloc or something like that, one of my great processes. Actually, before we do that, that JMP, jump instruction, is inserted by the EDR into certain calls, and actually the flow of execution is then directed up to evil EDR into this red box here in kernel mode. This is where the EDR vendors tell them, this is where we use AI and machine learning and lots of other awesome buzzwords that we haven't actually invented yet. I don't think if AI was invented, we'd all be stood here. We haven't invented AI as a species yet, but apparently EDR have. Then it examines it and passes it back to EDR, and then if it's legitimate, it's allowed, process execution is allowed to continue. If it's not legitimate, that process is terminated and a log is generated. So this is how it works. But you'll note that everything up until that JMP, and including the JMP instruction, so that's the jump instruction, if you're familiar with OSCE or OSCP certifications, or any of the core land stuff, this sits in user land. So the JMP to kernel mode sits in user land, and we sit in user land. So why don't we just unhook it? And then we're not going into kernel mode, which means we're not getting investigated by AI. Or a really long list of if-else statements, but there we are. Maybe I'm being cynical, who knew? So actually, Silence, do you want to say that for me? Good? Yeah. So Silence hooks each particular function and then passes it to scimemdef64, which is one of the Silence function DLLs. So here we're examining ntdll.dll. And you can see it's got a jump instruction with ZW create thread. But this, again, sits in userland. So I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader as to how you unhook that, but it's not that hard. And then that will prevent Cylance from seeing quite a significant part of your activity. I should give a quick shout out here to Adam Chester at MDSec. He's done some really good research, as has Nettitude's Kyriakos, again, a fearsomely talented researcher. They've done some really good research that allowed some really easy to weaponize exploits or bypasses for most EDRs, which is quite good. And again, they'll unhook these things in a particularly covert fashion. You could unhook all the things, but actually, from a detection side of life, you start standing out then. That's the presence of the abnormal. Now, certainly in Nettitude side of life, when we utilize this technique, we just unhook certain things and then do our activity and then rehook it back in. Just as a random one again, EDR's the latest and greatest. If we look back at Excel 4, which is like an Excel 4 scripting language, it's probably older than me. Actually, the interpreter for that lives in excel.exe itself. Doesn't call any external scripting engines. So there's zero AMSI integrations for it. Think of it as just like the daddy of VBA. It's like so old that hardly anybody knows about it, apart from the offensive security community. Here's a really dead simple example of how you actually make use of Excel 4. Generate yourself some shell code from Cobalt Strike, from Posh, or whatever. Just quickly run it through MSF Venom just to strip out any null bytes, because Excel 4 doesn't play well with null bytes. Then just use Sharpshooter from MDSec from DOM shell to generate yourself an SLK, pass it your shellcode file, and off we go. Okay, so now moving into what can you do as a defender to try and get on the front foot. If we've said in terms of getting it, you can't have a response without a detection, but if you were relying on your super awesome silver bullet EDR for your detection, but we've just unhooked it, how are you going to get a detection? You're probably not. So how you get a response? Well, you're not. So what we can do, though, is genuinely, until we land from a fish, we have zero knowledge of what your infrastructure looks like none at all. We might find in TI someone's LinkedIn profile saying, we use Cisco switches. Okay, yeah, not that actually weaponizable, not that actionable for me. But more importantly, you guys on the blue side do know, you should at least know your network inside and out. And you should know what normal is and have telemetry. So what you can do, if you can't defend everything all the time, you can probably prioritize around your critical economic functions or whatever your organization considers critical assets. So what you can do is try and lay some minefields for us. We don't know where we need to go when we land, but you know where we're going to go. So you can plan and lay some deceptions and minefields ahead of us. And you can implement some deceptions or some honeycreds and things like that and get back on the front foot. Because if you aren't getting a detection from Cylance or any other EDR, maybe you need some other way of getting a detection, and making use of deceptions is probably a good start. So this is a really easy way of catching Kerberoasting. So relatively low-skill attackers or low-skill red team will immediately land in an environment and Kerberoast the domain, which in a large organization could return you 134,000 service principal name TGS tickets, which will slow even Nettitude's password cracker down, 134,000 of them. So what we can do is roast selectively, Kerberoast selectively, from the correct user context. What you can do as defenders, though, is just genuinely make a new Active Directory user, just pass in some data here to make it look realistic, and then just create a service principal name for it using that command there. These are all on our GitHub as well. So this is doable in maybe under 15 seconds, depending on how fast you can type, and then you've got a really good detection. This one little command gives you 2 chances at a detection, so you've gone from no chances to 2. Because this user doesn't actually do anything, it doesn't provide SQL services like the service principal name says, then in theory, there should never be a TGS requested for it as part of a Kerberoast attack. So when a TGS is requested for that username, you know that you're being Kerberoasted because no user would actually request that normally. The second time is you've given it a honey password, so it's probably sitting in RockU or something crazy like that. Then you know the attacker will break that password, trivially. And then from that, he will then use that account to authenticate or to try and authenticate across the network, which again gives you your second chance at a detection, because that should never happen, because that user account shouldn't be doing anything. More importantly though, certainly from the Nettitude side, we are quite firm believers in the cyber kill chain being an iterative cycle. So we have seen customers deploy this, ironically after we told them about it. They almost caught us again when we did another red team for them, except that the Active Directory user they created looked a little bit suspicious, as in it looked too good to be true. And we were like, okay. So again, we've got some new information, a new account. Then we went back to the start of the cyber kill chain and began situational awareness. So we looked up the user that we thought was too good to be true. Well, actually, we cross-referenced it back with TI and went back into LinkedIn. Turns out it was a Honey account because he allegedly started at the company in 2017, but actually in 2017 he was working in a different country. So actually it was a Honey account. So that's just the importance of like high-level red teams will cross-reference everything they see in the environment with what we can see from outside the environment. That's why threat intelligence is absolutely critical, or having the ability to call on threat intelligence people from a red team side of life. So really easy detection for very, very little outlay. Again, Honey shares a really, really easy way of doing, if you're concerned about people getting into your cloud environment or whatever, you will have high-risk users, or you'll know that certain file shares are more prone to compromise. Just create a share, drop some juicy-looking files in there that you guess that like an attacker will go after, and then just alert for 5140s coming from that environment. And if you aren't in a place where you can start looking for these event codes, are you really at that stage of maturity cycle where you need to be doing red teaming straight away? You've got to have some visibility to have a detection, because without a detection you can't have a response. So you should be able to collect event codes from most of your servers and workstations before you're going down this route. And as I say, this is a Splunk rule. If you haven't got Splunk or you're using something else, copy and paste that, which is on our GitHub, into uncoder.io, and it will translate it into any other SIEM tool you want. It's got loads of pre-built queries for most of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Just click what you want, and then click what type of SIEM you've got, and it will generate you all the SIEM alerts that you need. In terms of technical bar to entry, it's quite low. Here's another really good account from Think's Canary, who make Canary tokens. So this took me 15 seconds to generate, make some Honey AWS creds, and you then drop them in, say, your principal cloud engineer's user profile, or somebody else who you're concerned who would be a high-impact, high-severity risk of compromise. Drop them in his user profile or their user profile. And when we steal them, because obviously AWS creds just sitting in plain text, it looks like this. You get the source IP where it's come from, you get the external IP, and then you also get 419, which is a user agent. Why that's quite important is you can then alert off the back of that. You know that that particular user, because you'll have unique Honey creds for each user, has been detected. But also, more importantly, on the red side, we will know we've been rumbled at that point. So this is what happens when we use, on the red side, Honey tokens. We know that that account's probably burned. More importantly, certainly on the Nettitude side of life, before we would do something like this, we'd have removed attribution. So we'd have diversified quite heavily. So this is a relatively high risk thing, high risk of getting detected actually using those credentials. So we'll have diversified in terms of user account that we're operating under, proxy account that we're going out through the proxy with, execution method, whether it's COM, WIMI, or anything like that, DLL entry points if we're going down that road, and so in every single variable that's under our control from the red team side, we'll have diversified by the point that we're doing this. So although you will absolutely get an awesome detection from this, in terms of kicking us out, just by resetting that machine or isolating that user, we'll still be in from a different context. Interestingly though, as well, if you do log into Amazon's control panel from Kali Linux, all of the administrative usernames in that account get an email saying, warning, someone's just logged into Amazon with a penetration testing distribution, make sure this is legit. But again, we know that on the red side, so we'll just use Internet Explorer or Chrome from Windows VM. Okay, and again, really simple way. Lots of people are running PAM solutions now, privileged access management, whether it's like CyberArk, if you've got a large budget, Manage Engine or something similar. So we're obviously going to have to go after that at some point. But actually, why don't you just drop some fake shortcuts in file shares that are labeled CyberArk. You know we're going to find them. You know we're going to instantly access them. So what you can then do is get like a really strong detection off the back of it. You'll get exactly what our usernames are, what our hostname and our user agent, and then you can track that internally. You can track that IP to a user, and then you can track that user to an email, and you can track that email to an execution method, and all of a sudden, off something really quite simple, you've actually got quite a lot of information you can pull together for a threat hunt. All from something that got, maybe a good solid 20 seconds worth of work there, so well within the realms of achievability. So let's have a talk about a bit more of what Red can see from the deception side of life. And there's quite a few deception products out there now. Some of them are quite genuinely really, really good. So let's say we're looking here at a Mimikatz dump. If you're not familiar with Mimikatz, we just pull in plain text creds out. But this is a Windows 10 box. And we're pulling plain text creds out of memory. Too good to be true. Shouldn't be a thing. It requires active effort to kill it, to achieve that, sorry. So what... that looks weird to us. It looks too good to be true. We've got really interesting users here, and then a relatively trivial password. Again, looks too good to be true. We've also got users down here that may or may not exist actually in the Active Directory. This is actually an entirely fictitious test domain. It's not actually customer stuff, so it's a fictional test domain. Again, this user here doesn't actually exist in Active Directory, but yet his credentials are in memory. Quite obviously a honey token. Also, we can see that these passwords here, quite short, not very complex, actually shorter than the domain password policy. So they can't be legitimate because the domain wouldn't let them set those credentials. And that's just all come from situational awareness and feeding back in what you've got, knowledge-wise, back into your intelligence and information gathering. You need to know what the domain password policy is, which is pretty trivial to get, to actually detect these sorts of things. It's worth noting that this particular defensive product, when you do trigger a single detection, immediately bangs an exe onto that endpoint that you've triggered the detection from, and then in effect gives them almost forensic level. It videos the screen, every single registry read and write, and file system changes. It's exceptionally comprehensive. Again, here's some test data. If we look in recent places, we can see, do these fit what we expect they do? So PuTTY, people will save PuTTY sessions, but is it likely that someone from HR is using PuTTY to manage switches? I would say potentially they've got some quite significant job issues if they are. HR shouldn't be running your core switching infrastructure. They're good at HR, and we'll leave the switching infrastructure to the Cisco guy. But again, certain products will save PuTTY sessions and pagent sessions on HR machines. It's not granular enough. Out of the box, it's okay, but actually it requires quite extensive configuration, much like any security product. Any product that promises to fix all of your problems straight out the box, I would raise a significant eyebrow. Also map drives, so some of these deceptions or detections will say //file01, right? I've never seen a file server called file01 in an organization that's big enough to be doing proper red teaming. They will have a naming convention that is, // site name, data center name, W or L for Windows or Linux, and then a number, and then it will have an appropriately named share. It certainly won't have anything like file01. So again, it looks too good to be true, but you will obviously know what the naming convention of your target is and good stuff like that. Also, injecting Internet Explorer credentials into the credential vault in Windows 10 or Windows 7, which are then decryptable through DPAPI or RPC, straight to the DC using the domain master key. Looks too good to be true. Not many people actually use that functionality, really. And actually, there's easier ways for users at a usability level to save those creds. It's actually quite difficult sometimes for them to use it. So why would they? And then we're pulling really juicy credentials out of memory. Looks a little bit too good to be true, because it is. And also, is it likely that sales are also moonlighting as a SQL developer? If they are, again, hopefully not, because chance of them getting it wrong quite high. But again, certain products will drop these just in the user profile directory. So SQL developer basically has connections.xml, and in that is largely user and password plaintext creds. And as soon as you use those credentials or even touch that server at all, that's when they'll get a detection. So it's all about getting your situational awareness together, knowing how good the target is. Use Seatbelt from SpectreOps and the Ghost Pack series. pull the sysmon configs and good stuff like that. Make use of sysmon whitelisted binaries to inject into where you can. Most people, again, will whitelist their network monitoring tools. Okay, so coming towards the end now, I quite firmly believe that technology by itself isn't going to save you by itself. You need to blend that with people and process. You can't just buy your way to security. It's not going to happen. Best of luck to you if you are trying that genuinely, but ultimately the people and your internal business processes are the only way to complement that technology. Defense in depth. We've touched on how EDR won't save you or won't save the blue side, but actually defense in depth will. Strong Active Directory logging, strong offensive spirit from the blue side, putting those deceptions in. They will all make a real big difference, because once you get a detection, you've got the initiative on the blue side. Remember, on the red side, we don't know you've got a detection. We are blind. We're basically doing keyhole surgery down a command and control channel, whereas you have ultimate visibility on the blue side. Well-exercised playbooks. Lots of people do have playbooks, and that's generally a really solid start. Lots of people also store those playbooks on the same file shares that we have access to, so it's pretty awesome. It's like, oh, you can literally see the timelines of who they're going to call and when. When we combine that with, we have an internal C2 framework that can video screens relatively simply. It's pretty awesome to look at a video of the incident commander dialing, using a VoIP soft phone, dialing the incident response firm, because we're on our left-hand monitor, we are looking at their incident response plan that we've stolen, and on the right-hand side, we're watching him scrolling through it on his screen and dialing the numbers off his VoIP phone. It's pretty awesome. Obviously, we then just turned off his VoIP phone. So actually, it's important to have a playbook and keep them secure. We invented password vaults. They're not just for passwords. We can put other things in them too, documents, for example. But actually, exercising them is critical without the staff knowing it's a test. That's the really good stuff about CBEST, TBEST, GBEST, and all that good stuff, or TIBA, or CAST, or any other framework you want to talk about. Exercising those playbooks as rigorously as possible, even if it costs you more. So we had an engagement recently, we were on day 8, and we were doing quite well from the red side, but actually they had some detections, but they hadn't managed to kick us out. So in terms of containment and eradication, it wasn't that strong. So we had a daily update call, as you should be doing if you're doing red teaming, and they said, we are struggling to maintain business as usual operations and run this incident. We were just like, well, it's only day 8, got another 3 weeks, what are you going to do? And actually, their playbook didn't really go that far. Their playbook will have kicked you out by then. It's like, well, actually, this is a really good chance to stretch what the playbook is, add an extra paragraph, which is phone an IR company, and then actually do it. Don't just say in your playbook, yeah, at this point, we're going to pick up the phone and ring an IR firm. Do it. It's going to cost you a couple of grand. Yeah, fine. In the area of business we're operating in, that's not that expensive. And also, you actually work out a significant number of frictions by getting an IR company in. Most IR companies' immediate answer is to come in and roll their EDR software across the environment to get some visibility. That's a big shout, that, actually. You're trying to contain an incident, you're about to roll out untested, unconfigured software across your entire estate. Are you not just introducing more risk there? You should have, how does that function in your environment? Does everything break? Is your Active Directory schema compatible with it? You don't know these things until you try it. And believe me, the first time you find all these lessons, it's not going to be a palatable exercise, so better to find them in a test than find them in a real breach. And there's a German World War II sort of military philosopher, I guess, or strategist called Clausewitz, who said, actually, warfare is quite simple. You march towards the enemy, he marches towards you, you basically engage, and you fix each other whilst you both try and outflank each other, and actually that's quite simple. But actually, getting that achieved is really difficult because of really small little frictions. You want to pay an IR company, okay, but the person who can authorize that's on holiday. What now? You want to do that, but the CTO's on playing golf in Scotland, and he can't get back. What now? The answer is a helicopter, but you've got to work through these little frictions, tiny little frictions that seem trivial. But actually, when you all stack them up across an incident that could last a month, 6 months, 2 years, unless you work those out and actually exercise it properly, you'll never know. You'll learn those really, really difficult lessons when you really don't want to be learning lessons. You want to be running a really smooth execution. And so getting some visibility, if you're not doing Active Directory logging, you're depriving yourself of quite a significant detection ability. Getting endpoint visibility, EDRs belongs on every box. We routinely see it. People have got EDR on the workstations and then some sort of like crazy McAfee or something on the servers. Like, why bother? You may as well just not bother. Get EDR everywhere, because ultimately we're going to get off tertiary workstations onto secondary servers at some point. So you don't want to lose all of your visibility just as we get a Privesk. That's like the exact opposite of what you want. You need visibility to be constant. This is quite a large one because, granted, you don't want your level 1 analyst making decisions that are above their pay grade, but also, you need to be prepared as a business and have a well-exercised playbook as to how you do it of cutting a country off. If you're an intercontinental company with offices in 100 countries, an Active Directory trust flying around in a matrix organization, you need to be prepared to cut comms with one of those countries that's being breached. That's okay. It's going to be exceptionally unpalatable from a business ops point of view, but that one country is going to compromise the other 99. Have a plan. How do you do that? Organizationally, technically it's very easy. You just turn the site-to-site VPN off. That's fine. But actually, organizationally, and a people and a process level, how do you do that? Who can make that decision? Also, segregation. I remember maybe just after I started in Nettitude, I had communications from a workstation in London to a workstation in Singapore, ironically, to a workstation in Hong Kong, and then back to Amsterdam. Why is that even possible on a layer 3 point of view? From a routing and switching point of view, segregation is hard, and I do admit that. I have been a network admin. It is very difficult, but workstation to workstation communications, very, very rarely legitimate. We invented the whole concept of servers so that workstations don't have to talk to each other. So going forward, as maybe you move into a hybrid Azure, hybrid AWS, or something like that, or Google Cloud if you're feeling bold, going forward, put segregation in. I think we can probably all agree that organizations who are like intercontinental have huge amounts of technical debt. They'll never fix the segregation problems looking rearwards in their old infrastructure. It's probably unachievable. But going forwards, they can have a rule that new infrastructures will be segregated appropriately, and that will hugely, hugely make lateral movement within those environments much, much difficult, Or just use on-host firewalling, like genuinely. Lots of places just don't do any firewalling whatsoever because they say, oh, it doesn't work in our business. And then you actually drill down into that a little bit more, and you realize that a good solid 90% of that business is just generic office people doing Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, genuinely nothing that complicated. So they're eminently suitable for on-host firewalling. Then maybe you've got some developers or super custom stuff developing medical equipment or something. Maybe they'll just need an exception in the firewall, But still, you've still got 90% of the organization with on-host firewalling. The excuse of it's too hard isn't really an excuse, if you ask me. More importantly, again, just a bit of a heads up that lots of people do red teaming too early, and it's catastrophic for them, and it can be really unpalatable. It can be the stimulus that they need or a catalyst to make some really significant changes. Or sometimes it can just be so catastrophic it's almost it gets put in a file and hidden away because it's just uncomfortable reading. So you should be having all the low-hanging fruits swept up by the time you're doing threat intelligence-led testing. Get rid of all those low-hanging fruits. Get a dedicated forest-wide Active Directory audit from someone who knows what they're doing, like an ex-MCSE or something like that. Get someone like that. It's almost disheartening when we get to the objectives using really low-hanging fruit. It's almost disheartening. We prefer it when you test us. When we've got to find new 0 days from Kyriakos or someone like that. We find that really awesome. And weaponizing those is really good. Finding, creds in a file, it's it's not really where we need to be. It makes you be the armadillo. So an armadillo is really, really hard on the outside, really tough shell. But actually, when you turn the armadillo over, it's really soft, it's really squishy, it's really vulnerable. Lots and lots of organizations are armadillos, and we don't want that. We want the security onion, the layered approach. I'm just coming towards the end now, so I say thanks very much to these guys here. I didn't touch on all of their content there, but throughout, these gentlemen here have been banging out some really solid research on how to do red teaming or new techniques. Definitely worth following those gentlemen. Any questions? All good. In that case, I'm finished. Thank you very much.